Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Floating Sanctuary wasn't the worst place to end up in the outer sectors, but it definitely wasn't anyone's first choice for a career move. The research station orbited a contested moon that 3 different species claimed ownership of, which meant nobody actually owned it, which meant it became neutral ground, which meant it attracted every diplomat, scientist, and bureaucrat with something to prove. Or hide, sometimes both. Sloan had been on the station for 8 months now, and she'd learned to tune out the constant hum of political posturing that filled the corridors like background radiation. Her job was simple, refreshingly so. Study cross-species emotional intelligence in non-sapient creatures. Figure out if a Terran dog could read the body language of a Centauri sandrunner. See if a Shenri hunting cat understood the distress calls of Earth chickens. That sort of thing. It beat the alternative, which had been teaching xenobiology to disinterested undergrads on a colony world where the most exciting thing that happened all year was the Harvest Festival. She was in the middle of cataloging behavioral data when the station's intercom crackled to life. Lissith's voice, tight with the special kind of tension that meant someone important was about to make everyone else's life complicated. All personnel, please be advised. The Shenri diplomatic delegation has arrived. Repeat, Shenri delegation is now on station. Exercise appropriate cultural sensitivity. Sloan snorted. Cultural sensitivity. Right. That was code for, don't stare at the 8-foot-tall raptor people with the teeth that could punch through hull plating. She saved her work and stood, stretching. The Shenri didn't usually bring their disputes to Floating Sanctuary. They preferred to handle disagreements the old-fashioned way. Ritual combat, blood oaths, and the occasional planetary annexation. If they were here for talks with the Lithos, things must be serious. Or someone was desperate enough to try diplomacy before the shooting started. The Grand Hall had been transformed for the occasion. Banners hung from the ceiling, displaying the symbols of a dozen different species in what was probably meant to be an inspiring show of unity, but mostly looked like a cosmic patchwork quilt. The Lithos delegation occupied one side of the room, their crystalline bodies refracting the overhead lights into rainbow patterns across the walls. On the other side, the Shenri stood in a loose formation that managed to look both casual and vaguely threatening. Sloan slipped in through a side entrance, keeping to the periphery. She wasn't here officially. Curiosity had simply gotten the better of her. Plus, she'd heard rumors that the Shenri ambassador was bringing his offspring, and she had a professional interest in observing juvenile behavior in predator species. Professional. Sure, let's go with that. The ambassador himself was impressive, even by Shenri standards. Forsec stood, nearly 9 feet tall, his scales a deep crimson that darkened to black along his spine. Ceremonial armor covered his chest and shoulders, etched with symbols that Sloan couldn't read, but assumed meant something along the lines of, "I've killed a lot of things, and looked good doing it." Behind him, 3 smaller figures fidgeted. The cubs. Sloan's attention locked onto them immediately. They were adolescents, maybe equivalent to human 10-year-olds, but already the size of large dogs. Their scales hadn't fully hardened yet, giving them a slightly mottled appearance. One of them, the smallest, kept trying to gnaw on her brother's tail, while a harried-looking handler attempted to maintain order. This, Sloan thought, is going to be entertaining. The preliminary speeches began. The Lithos representative spoke first, their voice resonating in harmonics that made Sloan's teeth ache. Something about resource allocation and territorial boundaries, and mutual respect for sovereign claims. Standard diplomatic boilerplate, dressed up in flowery language that didn't change the fact that both sides wanted the same chunk of real estate. Forsec responded with the Shenri equivalent of diplomatic niceties, which involved a lot of references to honor and strength and the glory of combat. He'd brought his cubs, he explained, as a gesture of trust. to show that the Shenri came in peace, seeking understanding rather than conflict. The subtext, of course, was that he'd brought his children to a negotiation because he was confident enough in his position that he didn't need to worry about their safety. Power move, Sloan had to admit. Ballsy. The meeting broke for refreshments, and that's when things got interesting. The handler, clearly overwhelmed by three energetic predators in an enclosed space full of strangers, made a critical error. He turned his back to check his datapad. The cubs bolted. It happened fast. One moment they were sitting in a reasonably dignified cluster behind their father. The next, they were streaking across the hall in three different directions, tails whipping behind them, claws scrabbling on the polished floor. Delegates scattered. Someone screamed. A lithos scientist stumbled backward, their crystalline body chiming like broken glass. Sloan watched two of the cubs veer toward the refreshment table, clearly interested in the various alien delicacies on display. The third, the female if she remembered Shenri's sexual dimorphism correctly, locked eyes with her. Oh no, the cub charged. Sloan had maybe 3 seconds to make a decision. Run, and trigger every predatory chase instinct the little monster possessed. Stand still, and risk being knocked over by 60 pounds of muscle and teeth moving at full speed. Fight, and cause a diplomatic incident that would probably get her fired and possibly deported. She chose option 4, redirect. As the cub closed the distance, Sloan dropped into a crouch, making herself smaller, less threatening. She extended one hand, palm down, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The cub skidded to a halt, confused by prey that wasn't acting like prey. Sloan kept her breathing steady, her posture relaxed but alert. Eye contact, but not too much. Assertive, not aggressive. The same technique she'd used on everything from territorial dogs to imported Rigelian pack hunters. The cub sniffed her hand, huffed, then did exactly what curious juveniles of every species tended to do when confronted with something new and interesting. She nipped at Sloan's wrist. Not hard. Playful, really. Testing. The teeth didn't break skin, but they definitely communicated that they could if their owner decided to get serious about it. The hall had gone silent. Everyone was staring. Sloan could see Forsek starting to move, his expression unreadable behind the predatory features. Time for the moment of truth. Sloan kept her movements economical, quick but not violent. She brought her free hand up and tapped the cub firmly on the nose. Not a slap, not a hit, just a clear, definitive tap that said, in the universal language of mammals everywhere, no, bad, we don't do that. The cub froze. Sloan maintained eye contact, kept her body language calm but authoritative, and in a low voice that carried despite its volume said, "Sit." The cub sat. Her two brothers, who had been in the process of demolishing the refreshment table, stopped mid-rampage and turned to look. Sloan pointed at the floor beside their sister. "Here, now!" They came. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the way she projected absolute certainty that they would obey. Maybe it was just dumb luck, and the fact that juvenile predators of any species were hardwired to respond to confident parental figures. Whatever the reason, within 10 seconds, all three cubs were sitting in a perfect line in front of Sloan, tails still, eyes fixed on her face with the kind of attention usually reserved for pack leaders and food dispensers. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Sloan could hear her own heartbeat in the silence, could feel the weight of every eye in the room. She resisted the urge to say something sarcastic, to diffuse the tension with humor. Instead, she slowly stood, keeping her movements calm, and gently placed one hand on the nearest cub's head. "Good," she said quietly. "Very good." The cub's tail twitched, almost wagged. Forsek's voice cut through the silence, speaking in his native language. The handler rushed forward, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. He started to reach for the cubs, clearly expecting resistance. They went with him peacefully, though the female kept looking back at Sloan with something that might have been confusion or curiosity, or the predator equivalent of, "Hey, that was fun. Can we do it again?" Sloan became aware that her hands were shaking, adrenaline finally catching up. She clasped them behind her back and tried to look like she hadn't just had a minor heart attack. Forsec approached. Up close, he was even more imposing, all teeth and scales and coiled strength. His eyes, surprisingly expressive, studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You," he said, his galactic standard heavily accented but clear, "are either very brave or very foolish." Sloan managed what she hoped was a professional smile. "I've been told it's possible to be both simultaneously." The ambassador's head tilted, a gesture she recognized from her research: curiosity, interest, possibly respect, though it was hard to tell with a species that considered trial by combat a reasonable way to settle contract disputes. "How did you do that?" he asked. "My people train our young through discipline and strength. They learn to obey through dominance hierarchy. You touched my daughter with less force than a breeze, and she submitted. Explain." Sloan chose her words carefully. Diplomacy might not be her job, but she was smart enough to know when she was standing in a minefield. "I didn't make her submit," she said. "I gave her clarity. Young predators, in my experience, don't misbehave because they're trying to challenge authority. They do it because they're testing boundaries, trying to understand the rules. Your daughter nipped me. I corrected the behavior clearly and immediately, and she understood. No dominance required, just communication." Forsec stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised her. He laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound, but unmistakably genuine. "You make it sound simple," he said. "Most things are," Sloan replied, "once you figure out what everyone actually wants." The ambassador nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on her face. Then he turned and walked back to his delegation, leaving Sloan standing alone in the center of the hall with the distinct impression that she'd just stepped into something much bigger than a simple diplomatic reception. Lissith found her 20 minutes later, after the delegates had resumed their tedious negotiations and the hall had returned to its previous state of controlled chaos. "My office," the commander said, her voice flat. "Now." Sloan followed, already rehearsing her defense. She hadn't done anything wrong, technically. She'd prevented a potential incident, maintained order, demonstrated cross-species behavioral understanding. All good things. Lissith's office was small, efficient, and decorated with the kind of impersonal corporate art that made every station in the sector look identical. The commander sat behind her desk, rubbed her temples, and let out a long breath. "So," she said finally, "you just tapped them on the nose." "Yes." "And they sat?" "Yes." "All three of them?" "Yes." Lissith looked up, and Sloan was surprised to see something that might have been amusement in her eyes. "The Shenri ambassador wants to speak with you," she said. "Officially, he's requested a private meeting." Sloan's stomach dropped. "Is that good or bad?" "With the Shenri? Could go either way. They might decide you've insulted their honor by implying their training methods are inferior. Or they might decide you're the most fascinating thing they've encountered in a decade and want to dissect your brain to figure out how you did it. Metaphorically speaking. Probably. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be." Lissith leaned back in her chair. "For what it's worth, you handled that situation better than I would have. Better than most people would have. But Sloan, you need to understand, you just made yourself very visible to a species that values strength and results above almost everything else. That comes with consequences." "What kind of consequences?" The commander's expression was unreadable. "The interesting kind. The meeting's tomorrow, 0900, conference room 3. Don't be late. And for the love of everything, try not to accidentally start a war." Sloan left the office with her mind racing. She'd come to Floating Sanctuary to study animal behavior in a quiet, academic environment. Somehow, in the span of 30 seconds, she'd become a person of interest to one of the most powerful warrior cultures in the sector. She should have stayed on the colony world, teaching bored students about xenobiology. But as she walked back to her quarters, passing delegates and scientists and the endless political machinery of the station, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Excitement. Tomorrow's meeting would either be a disaster or an opportunity, possibly both. Either way, it definitely wasn't going to be boring. The gossip network on Floating Sanctuary operated faster than the station's quantum communicators. By the time Sloan woke up the next morning, half the station had apparently heard about the incident in the Grand Hall, and the other half had heard 3 different embellished versions that involved everything from mystical human powers to secret military training. Her message queue was overflowing. Requests for interviews from the station's news service. Questions from xenobiologists she'd never met. One particularly enthusiastic message from a Centauri researcher asking if she'd be willing to demonstrate her techniques on his aggressive lab specimens. She deleted that one immediately. The meeting with Forsec was scheduled for 0900. She arrived at 0855 because showing up early to meet with a species that valued punctuality and respect seemed like basic survival instinct. Conference Room 3 was larger than she'd expected, with a viewport that offered a stunning view of the contested moon below. Forsec was already there, standing near the window, his massive frame backlit by the planet's reflected light. He turned as she entered, and she was struck again by how utterly alien he was, all predatory grace and barely contained power. "Sloan," he said, pronouncing her name carefully. "Thank you for coming." "Ambassador," she replied, keeping her tone neutral and professional. "Your message said you wanted to discuss yesterday's incident." "Incident." He made that barking laugh again. "Yes, that is one word for it. Please, sit." She took a seat at the conference table, noting that he remained standing. Dominance display, probably. She didn't take it personally. Forsec paced, his claws clicking softly on the floor. "I have been thinking about what you said, about clarity and communication, about boundaries." He stopped, fixing her with those intense eyes. "My daughter Vika has been difficult since her hatching. Aggressive, willful, resistant to training. We thought it was simply her nature, that she would need stronger discipline to bring her in line with her brothers." Sloan kept her expression carefully neutral, but internally she was already seeing the pattern. But stronger discipline didn't work. No, it made her worse. He resumed pacing. "And then you, a human, a species we barely know, touched her once, and she obeyed instantly. Do you understand how that looks to my people?" "Like your training methods might not be as effective as you thought," Sloan offered, then immediately regretted the sarcasm when Forsec's head snapped toward her. But instead of anger, she saw something else in his expression. Frustration, maybe. Or exhaustion. "Exactly like that," he said quietly. "Which is why certain members of my delegation are currently arguing that you somehow used human trickery or technology to control my children. That what happened was an insult rather than a demonstration." "And what do you think?" Sloan asked. Forsec moved to the window, his reflection ghostly in the reinforced glass. "I think that my people are very good at many things: warfare, honor, strength. But perhaps we have been so focused on dominance that we forgot there might be other ways to lead." He turned back to her. "I have a proposal." Sloan's instincts, honed by years of dealing with unpredictable animals and even more unpredictable administrators, started screaming warnings. "I'm listening." "Train my children, 5 rotations. Teach them the way you would teach any young creature in your care. If you succeed, if you can show my people that there is value in your methods, I will support human integration into Shenri trade networks, full economic partnership. The words hung in the air like a live grenade. Sloane's mind raced. Trade networks. That was huge. The kind of huge that got mentioned in history books. The Shenri controlled shipping routes through half a dozen contested sectors. Access to their networks would transform human economic prospects in the outer regions. "And if I fail?" she asked, because she wasn't naive enough to think there wasn't a catch. "Then my rivals will use your failure as proof that humans are weak, that your methods are worthless, and that any species that relies on such softness is not worth our respect or partnership." Forsek's tone was matter-of-fact, neither threatening nor apologetic. Just honest. Your people will find it significantly harder to operate in Shenri space, politically, economically, diplomatically. So no pressure, then. I find that pressure often reveals the truth of a person's capabilities. Sloan stood, moved to the window, and stared out at the moon below. 5 rotations. 5 days to train 3 juvenile predators who'd been raised in a completely different cultural context, using methods that apparently half the Shenri delegation thought were either fake or insulting. She should say no. She should point out that she was a researcher, not a diplomat. That she had no authority to accept a challenge that could impact human-Shenri relations for decades. That this was way above her pay grade and entirely outside her job description. "I'll need access to the cubs every day," she heard herself say instead. "Minimum 3 hours, preferably more. I'll need a training space that's quiet, secure, and free from interference. And I'll need everyone to stay out of my way and let me work without commentary or criticism until the demonstration." Forsek's teeth showed in what she was starting to recognize as his version of a smile. "Agreed. I will make the arrangements." "One more thing," Sloan added, turning to face him. "I'm not doing this to prove anything about humans versus Shenri, or to make some grand statement about whose methods are better. I'm doing this because those kids deserve someone who'll treat them like individuals rather than soldiers in training. Clear?" "Extremely clear." The ambassador inclined his head, a gesture of respect. "I believe I am beginning to understand why my daughter sat for you." Sloan left the meeting feeling like she'd just agreed to juggle live explosives while riding a unicycle, which, given the circumstances, wasn't far from the truth. Lisseth, predictably, nearly had an aneurysm when Sloan reported back. "You did what?" The commander's voice could probably be heard 3 corridors away. "You bet our entire diplomatic standing on your ability to teach alien puppies to sit. They're not puppies. They're juveniles of a sophisticated predator species, and I didn't bet anything. Forsek made an offer, and I accepted. Big difference." "That is the thinnest semantic distinction I've ever heard." Lisseth collapsed into her chair. "Do you have any idea what you've done? If you fail, the political fallout could set back human expansion in this sector by decades. The Council is going to lose their minds. I'm going to lose my job. You're definitely going to lose your job." "Then I won't fail." "You say that like it's simple." "It is simple," Sloan said, echoing her words from the day before. "I treat them with respect, set clear boundaries, and give them structure. That's it. That's the whole secret. It's not magic, it's not trickery, it's just paying attention and responding. Appropriately." Lisseth stared at her for a long moment. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I've been working with animals my entire life, from earth dogs to Rigelian hunters to Centauri sand runners. The species changes, but the fundamentals don't. Every creature wants the same things: to feel safe, to understand the rules, and to know that someone in charge actually gives a damn about their well-being." Sloan leaned forward. "The Shenri train through dominance and fear. And sure, that works to a point, but it also creates animals that are stressed, unpredictable, and just waiting for an opportunity to challenge the hierarchy. My way might seem soft, but it builds trust. And trust is stronger than fear. Always." The commander rubbed her face. I hope you're right, because if you're wrong, we're all going to be very, very sorry. The news spread through the station with predictable speed. By midday, everyone knew about the challenge. Sloan couldn't walk through a corridor without drawing stares, whispers, or the occasional outright question from curious crew members. The lithos scientist, Hosselin, cornered her in the commissary during lunch. "This methodology of yours," they said, their crystalline body refracting the overhead lights into dancing patterns. "It defies statistical probability. The Shenri have used dominance-based training for generations. Success rate, approximately 83%. Yet you claim a gentler approach will yield superior results. The data does not support this conclusion." Sloan poked at her food, which claimed to be chicken but tasted like recycled protein paste pretending to be chicken. "Maybe your data's incomplete." "Impossible. We have observed Shenri training protocols across multiple generations and contexts." "But have you observed anyone trying a different approach?" Hosselin paused, their internal structures shifting in what might have been their equivalent of a thoughtful expression. "No. The Shenri do not permit outside observation of alternative methods." "Then your data's incomplete," Sloan repeated. "You can't compare what works versus what doesn't work if you've only ever measured one approach." "Fascinating." The lithos leaned closer, studying her with unsettling intensity. "I wish to observe your training sessions. For scientific documentation." "No. I would be completely unobtrusive. You're a 7-foot-tall crystal person who chimes when you move. You're the opposite of unobtrusive. And besides, I need the cubs to focus on me, not on an audience. So thanks, but no." Hosselin made a sound like wind chimes in a thunderstorm. Disappointment, probably. "Your species is remarkably resistant to scientific collaboration. We are also remarkably good at not failing spectacularly in front of witnesses, which is what I'm trying to avoid here." She escaped the commissary before anyone else could accost her with questions, requests, or thinly veiled accusations of fraud. The training Space Forsec arranged was perfect. A converted cargo bay with high ceilings, reinforced walls, and enough room for the cubs to move around without feeling cramped. Someone had even installed padding on the floor, presumably to prevent injuries during the more energetic moments of training. Sloan spent the rest of the day setting up, arranging equipment, and preparing her approach. She'd requested some basic supplies: toys, treats compatible with Shenri physiology, training markers. The station's quartermaster had looked at her like she'd requested antimatter warheads, but eventually came through. That evening, alone in the empty bay, she allowed herself a moment of honest doubt. What if she was wrong? What if the cubs' obedience yesterday had been a fluke, a lucky coincidence of timing and circumstances that she couldn't replicate? What if Shenri juveniles really did require dominance-based training, and her method simply didn't translate across species? What if she failed, and took human credibility down with her? She pushed the thoughts away. Doubt was natural, useful even in small doses. But right now she needed confidence. The cubs would sense uncertainty the same way Earth dogs did, and they'd respond accordingly. Tomorrow she'd start training. Tomorrow she'd prove that kindness wasn't weakness. Tomorrow she'd better be right. Because if she wasn't, the consequences would be spectacular, far-reaching, and entirely her fault. She left the cargo bay and headed back to her quarters, trying to ignore the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Just treat them like people, she reminded herself, like individuals who deserve respect. How hard could it be? Spoiler alert, probably very hard, but she'd figure it out. She always did. Probably. The first training session started exactly as Sloan expected. Chaotic, loud, and with entirely too many teeth. Resh, Toril, and Vika entered the cargo bay like small hurricanes with scales, immediately scattering in 3 different directions to investigate every corner, crevice, and potentially climbable surface. The handler who'd brought them looked relieved to hand them over, backing out of the room so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. Sloan let them explore. First rule of working with intelligent creatures: let them acclimate to new environments on their own terms. Forcing calm never worked. You had to let the energy burn off naturally. She sat on the padded floor, cross-legged, and waited. Toral found her first. He approached cautiously, head low, nostrils flaring as he scented her. She remained still, non-threatening, letting him decide whether she was interesting enough to investigate further. He nudged her knee with his snout. She didn't react. He did it again, harder. Testing. "Hey," she said softly. "Gentle." Toral sat back on his haunches, tilting his head in that universal gesture of confusion that transcended species barriers. Then Vika barreled into him from the side, and both cubs went tumbling across the floor in a tangle of tails and clicking claws. Sloan bit back a smile. Siblings. Same chaos, different biology. By the end of hour one, she'd established the basics. Her voice meant something. Calm tone, calm response. Sharp tone, pay attention. She used treats sparingly, relying more on play and positive attention. The cubs responded exactly as she'd hoped, learning that good behavior earned them games, while rough behavior earned timeouts. Nothing fancy, just consistency. By hour three, all three cubs would sit on command, stay for approximately 15 seconds before patience failed them, and come when called. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Forsec appeared at the observation window halfway through the second rotation session, watching in silence as Sloan guided Vika through a simple obstacle course using nothing but voice commands and encouraging gestures. She pretended not to notice him. The cubs' focus was what mattered. After the session ended and the cubs had been returned to their quarters, the ambassador entered the bay. His expression was unreadable, which Sloan was beginning to realize was his default state. "They are responding well," he said, statement rather than question. "They're smart kids. They want to learn. They just needed someone to teach them in a language they understand." "My people would say you are making them soft, weak." Sloan faced him directly. "Your people would be wrong. There's nothing weak about impulse control, cooperation, or choosing to follow instructions because you trust the person giving them. That's not weakness, that's intelligence." Forsec made a low, rumbling sound in his chest. Agreement? Disagreement? Digestive distress? Hard to tell. "I am beginning to see that," he admitted. "Though I suspect many of my delegation will not agree, regardless of what you demonstrate. Can't please everyone. No, but you can make them respect you through results." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Sloan, you should know. There are those among my people who do not want you to succeed, who see this challenge as an opportunity to embarrass both me and your species. I figured as much. Politics is pretty universal. They may attempt to interfere. That got her attention. Interfere how? I do not know. But I wanted you to be aware." His tail lashed once, sharp and controlled. "If anything seems wrong, inform me immediately." He left before she could respond, leaving Sloan alone with the uncomfortable knowledge that she wasn't just fighting against time and skepticism, she was fighting against active sabotage. Great. Fantastic. Exactly what she needed. The third rotation started normally enough. The cubs bounded into the bay with their usual enthusiasm, greeting Sloan like she was the best thing that had happened to them all day, which, given that their alternative was sitting in quarters with nothing to do, she probably was. They ran, through the established routines: sit, stay, come, gentle. Sloan introduced new commands, watching with satisfaction as the cubs picked them up quickly. Vika, in particular, was a natural, her earlier difficult behavior transforming into focused attention once she understood what was expected. Then, about 90 minutes into the session, Vika's demeanor shifted. Her ears flattened, Her tail went rigid. She started growling, a low continuous rumble that made the hair on Sloane's arms stand up. "Vicka, easy," Sloan said, using her calm voice. "What's wrong, kiddo?" But Vicka wasn't looking at her. She was staring at her brothers, body tensed like she was preparing to attack. Resh and Toril, sensing the threat, immediately went defensive. Within seconds, all three cubs were snarling at each other, the careful progress of the past few days evaporating like morning mist. Sloan moved between them, using her body as a barrier. "No, stop. Resh, sit. Toril, sit. Vicka, look at me." They ignored her. This wasn't normal aggression. This was panic response, fight-or-flight instinct overriding training. Something was wrong. Sloane's eyes swept the bay, searching for the cause. Everything looked normal. Same space, same setup, same conditions as the previous sessions. But something had changed. Something the cubs could sense that she couldn't. Then she caught it. A faint smell, acrid and sharp, barely perceptible to her human nose but apparently overwhelming to the cubs' more sensitive olfactory systems. Someone had introduced something into the training space. A chemical, a pheromone maybe, something designed to trigger stress responses in Shenri juveniles. Sabotage, just like Forsek had warned. Sloane's mind raced. She could call for help, but that would mean admitting something was wrong, admitting weakness. The saboteurs would have exactly what they wanted, proof that her methods failed under pressure, or she could adapt. She grabbed one of the toys from the equipment pile, a ball with bells inside that the cubs particularly enjoyed. She threw it across the bay, hard enough that it bounced off the far wall with a loud jangle. Three heads swiveled toward the sound. "Fetch!" Sloan commanded, putting every ounce of authority into her voice. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The cubs remained locked in their defensive postures, instinct warring with training. Then Resh broke. He lunged for the ball, prey drive overriding fear. Toril followed half a second later. Vicka hesitated, still growling, still tense. Sloan dropped to one knee, making herself smaller, less threatening. "Vicka," she said gently, "it's okay. I've got you. Nothing's gonna hurt you. Come here." The cub's eyes, wild and unfocused, slowly locked onto Sloane's face. Recognition flickered. "That's it. Come on, baby. Come to me." Vicka took one step, then another. Then she was pressing against Sloane's side, trembling, seeking comfort from the one stable thing in her suddenly frightening world. Sloan wrapped her arms around the cub, heedless of the claws and teeth, and held her until the shaking stopped. "I've got you," she murmured. "I've got you." Crisis averted. Barely. But now Sloan had a new problem. She had 2 rotations left to train in a compromised environment with saboteurs actively working against her and no guarantee that whatever they'd introduced into the bay today wouldn't be there tomorrow. She needed to figure out who was sabotaging the sessions, and she needed to do it fast. Because if she didn't, the demonstration in 2 days would be a disaster. And disasters, as everyone kept reminding her, had consequences. Sloan didn't sleep much that night. She spent hours reviewing security footage of the cargo bay, looking for anything suspicious, anyone who shouldn't have been there. The recordings showed nothing obvious. Whoever had introduced the stress pheromones had been careful, professional, which meant they weren't amateurs, which meant they'd probably try again. She reported the incident to Lysith, who immediately ordered a full sweep of the training bay. The security team found trace amounts of a synthetic compound designed to mimic Shenri danger signals, concentrated enough to affect juveniles, subtle enough that adults might not even notice it. "This is serious," Lysith said, her expression grim. "This isn't just sabotage. This is a deliberate attempt to undermine diplomatic negotiations. I should cancel the demonstration." "No," Sloan said firmly. "That's exactly what they want. They want me to quit, to prove that humans fold under pressure. Better to fold than to fail spectacularly in front of half the sector's diplomatic corps. I won't fail." Lisseth looked at her with something between admiration and exasperation. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most stubborn." "Why not both?" the commander sighed. "Fine, but I'm doubling security on the bay, and if anything else goes wrong, we're pulling the plug. Understood?" Sloan nodded, though they both knew that once the demonstration started, there'd be no pulling any plugs. She was committed now, for better or worse. The fourth rotation's training session was tense. Sloan kept waiting for something to go wrong, for another sabotage attempt, but nothing happened. The Cubs performed beautifully, running through increasingly complex commands with enthusiasm and precision. By the end of the session, Vika could navigate the obstacle course blindfolded, relying entirely on Sloan's voice for guidance. Trust. That's what they'd built. Not dominance, not fear. Just simple, honest trust. The fifth rotation arrived faster than Sloan would have liked. Demonstration day. The Grand Hall had been reconfigured, with seating arranged in a semicircle around a large open space. Delegates from a dozen species filled the seats, their conversations creating a multilingual hum that set Sloan's teeth on edge. She spotted Forsec near the front, his expression neutral, but his posture suggesting tension. Behind him, several other Shenri watched with expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. The saboteurs, probably, hoping to watch her fail. Jocelyn sat in the second row, crystalline body still, recording equipment active. The Ochre Collective's representative occupied an entire section, their multiple forms clustered together in what might have been anticipation or might have been indigestion, hard to tell with hive minds. Lisseth caught Sloan's eye from across the hall and gave her a small nod. Support. Or possibly a farewell. Again, hard to tell. Sloan took her position in the center of the demonstration space, hands clasped behind her back to hide the trembling. Professional. Confident. Absolutely not terrified. The Cubs were brought in, and the moment they saw Sloan, their entire demeanor changed. Tails wagging, ears forward, bodies practically vibrating with excitement. Resh actually made a little chirping sound that might have been the Shenri equivalent of a happy bark. That, more than anything, steadied her nerves. These kids trusted her. She wasn't about to let them down. The demonstration began simply. Basic commands: sit, stay, come. The Cubs performed flawlessly, moving with precision and obvious eagerness to please. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Sloan moved to more complex tasks. The obstacle course, which all three Cubs navigated smoothly. Cooperative exercises, where they had to work together to solve simple puzzles. Impulse control tests, where treats were placed in front of them and they had to wait for permission before taking them. Everything was going perfectly. Too perfectly. That's when Sloan noticed the sound. Low frequency, barely perceptible, but definitely there. A hum that made her teeth ache and her chest feel tight. The saboteurs hadn't given up. They'd just changed tactics. The Cubs noticed it too. Their movements became jerky, uncertain. Vika's ears flattened. Toral started growling. Resh backed away from Sloan, eyes darting around the hall, searching for threats. This was it. The moment where everything could fall apart. The saboteurs had played their final card, introducing an aggression trigger directly into the demonstration itself. The Cubs were seconds away from losing control completely, from proving that Sloan's methods failed when it really mattered. She could see it in the audience's faces. Anticipation. Some wanted her to succeed. Others wanted her to fail. Either way, they were about to get a show. Sloan made a decision. Instead of fighting the aggression, she'd redirect it. Use it. "Resh!" she called, her voice cutting through the low-frequency hum. "Hunt!" The Cub's head snapped toward her, confused but interested. Hunt was a game they'd played during training, a controlled chase scenario that let them burn energy and practice coordination. Sloan pulled a toy from her pocket and threw it across the demonstration space. It bounced, rolled, made enticing noises. Resh hesitated. The humming sound pulled at him, demanded aggression, violence, but Sloan was asking him to hunt, to play, to do something that felt right even when everything else felt wrong. He lunged for the toy. Torl! Vika! Support! The command triggered their pack instincts. Support meant help your brother. Support meant work together. It was a training exercise they'd practiced until it became automatic. They moved. Within seconds, all three cubs were engaged in a coordinated hunt scenario, working as a team, following Sloan's commands, channeling their triggered aggression into purposeful action. It wasn't the demonstration she'd planned. It was better. She called commands rapid fire, turning the sabotage moment into an improvised showcase of everything the cubs had learned. Cooperation, focus, the ability to follow instructions even under stress. They moved like a single organism, precise and graceful, predators working in perfect harmony. The low-frequency hum cut off abruptly. Someone in the audience, probably Forsec, had figured out what was happening and stopped it. But it didn't matter. The cubs were locked in now, focused entirely on Sloan and the game. She ran them through increasingly complex scenarios, pushing their training to the limit, showing everyone watching exactly what trust and respect could accomplish. Finally, she called the halt command. Resh, Torl, Vika, formation. Three predators, still buzzing with adrenaline, still primed for action, stopped instantly. They moved to Sloan's position and sat in a perfect line, tails still, eyes fixed on her face, waiting for the next command, trusting that she'd tell them what to do next. The hall was silent. Sloan reached down and placed a hand on each cub's head in turn. Good, she said quietly. Very good. Then she looked up at Forsec, meeting his eyes directly, and said nothing. She didn't need to. The cubs spoke for themselves. The ambassador rose slowly. He said something in his native language, harsh syllables that rolled through the hall like thunder. Several Shenri in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Others looked shocked. Forsec switched to Galactic Standard. The saboteurs will identify themselves now, or I will identify them for you. And trust me when I say you would prefer the former. Three Shenri stood reluctantly. Sloan recognized them from earlier sessions, always watching, always judging. One of them started to speak, probably to justify their actions, but Forsec silenced him with a gesture. You sought to prove weakness, the ambassador said, his voice cold. Instead, you have proven only your own fear. Fear of change, fear of methods you do not understand, fear that perhaps, just perhaps, strength comes in forms you never considered. He turned back to Sloan. This human, using nothing but patience and respect, has accomplished what our traditional methods could not. She has earned the title I now grant her, kin friend, an honor never before given to an outsider. The hall erupted in conversation. Multiple languages, multiple opinions, but the general tone was clear. Shock, respect, and more than a little recalculation of previous assumptions. Hoslin approached after the crowd began to disperse. The data, they said, voice chiming with what might have been excitement, is extraordinary. I must revise several theoretical models. I must publish. You must leave her alone, Lissith interrupted, appearing at Sloan's elbow. She's had a very long day. The Lithos departed, still muttering about statistical anomalies and paradigm shifts. Lissith turned to Sloan. So, you just became the most influential human in Shenri space. How does it feel? Sloan watched the cubs being led away by their handler, all three looking back at her with obvious reluctance to leave. Exhausting, she admitted. Terrifying. Slightly surreal. Forsec wants you to consider a permanent liaison position. Official title, diplomatic status, the works. Too much politics. That's what I figured you'd say. Lissith smiled. For what it's worth, you did good work here. Really good work. Sloan nodded, suddenly too tired for words. She'd proven her point, shown that kindness and respect could accomplish things that force and dominance never could. Changed minds, opened doors, built bridges between species. And all she'd done was treat 3 kids like they deserved to be treated. Like people. Funny how revolutionary that simple concept turned out to be. She left the grand hall, ignoring the whispers and stares, and headed back to her quarters. Tomorrow she'd deal with the consequences, the offers, the requests for interviews and demonstrations and consultations. Tomorrow she'd figure out what came next. Tonight, she just wanted to sleep. Behind her, in the grand hall, delegates continued their heated discussions about training methods, cultural assumptions, and the unexpected ways that soft power could reshape political landscapes. And somewhere in the station, 3 juvenile predators curled up in their quarters, dreaming of obstacle courses and games and the human who'd shown them that trust was stronger than fear. That clarity was better than chaos, that sometimes the gentlest voice carried the most authority. Sloan had tapped their noses, and they'd sat in a line. Simple as that. Except it wasn't simple at all. It was revolutionary. And revolutions, even small ones, tended to have far-reaching consequences. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, everyone could rest.